Hey everyone, I wanted to do a series of videos, hopefully you'll find them helpful, discussing the various perspectives on the millennium. And that's talking about uh, Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, which talk about the binding of Satan for 1,000 years, the reign of Christ and his saints for 1,000 years, punctuated by the first resurrection and the second resurrection. You can take a look at the passage yourself. My goal in this series is not to uh, make a particular case for my view or for any particular view, but to really outline the differing perspectives that you're going to find out there, historically primarily, with regard to premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. We sometimes think of these as three monolithic, completely separate perspectives that have nothing in common. The reality is it's better to kind of think of them, I use the analogy of three continents that are kind of intersecting and overlapping. If you want to even think of it as a Venn diagram where you have three circles and they kind of intersect at some points and don't at other points. And maybe, I'm not sure that we could come up with a view where they all intersect or overlap and we have this sweet spot in the middle where everybody is kind of agreeing on everything. However, they do come close at certain points. And so if you look at the whole history of these various perspectives, you realize that we're dealing with these categories. You have the category of premillennialism, or let me use the analogy of a continent, where the geography and the climate and language families are kind of the same in a continent. But also within that continent, there are unique nations or countries where there's going to be certain distinct perspectives. So it's best to think not of premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism as three completely separate traditions, but more premillennialisms, plural, amillennialisms, and postmillennialisms. So I would like us to dive into this, discuss some of the varieties of these three perspectives: premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial. And I'm going to start with the premillennial perspective. And in subsequent videos, just to keep this at a manageable side, I will be dealing with varieties of amillennialism and varieties of postmillennialism. Before I do, though, I want to point out that I am describing historical variations of this. Today, I think you could probably align various historical perspectives with modern perspectives from popular teachers or commentators or theologians or denominations that may hold these various views. But primarily, I'm interested in the historical views. And I'm beginning with premillennialism, mostly because I believe, and I've made the case in other places, that it does seem to be, it's very, very early, and it may even be the original perspective of the earliest church, a premillennial expectation. So, brief definition: premillennialism is that Revelation chapter 20 has not begun yet. That period of 1,000 years, whether you take that symbolically or literally, that period described in Revelation 20 has not started, and it will not start until Christ returns. The return of Christ then is that is before that future 1,000-year period. Whatever that may mean. So again, I'm not making a case for that at this point. I'm just going to describe the various historical iterations of premillennialism beginning in the early church, and where we find most of them. Premillennialism tends to fade off into the distance and then completely fade out by 4th, 5th, 6th century, somewhere along that timeline. So let's begin. I have actually distinguished 5 perspectives or various forms or permutations or varieties of premillennialism in the early church. And the first one, and I'm just going to kind of describe the spectrum, and then we'll kind of dive in on each one a little bit in the continuum, each member of that continuum. So I'm going to put on the far left and I'm not, by putting them on the extremes, I'm not trying to discount that one is better or worse than the other, but I will say there is one that is completely objectionable. That is the one that I'm putting on the right side. But on the left, I'm going to put what's called just New Creation Premillennialism. And some people have described their modern position as New Creationism or New Creation Premillennialism. But New Creation Premillennialism is the belief that the millennium that described the 1,000-year period is either, and there's a couple variations of this that you'll encounter, it's either or either, either. It's either a to be identified with the new creation itself. That is, the millennium is a symbol for the new creation. It's earthly, it is future, and it comes after Christ's return. And it is all of these Old Testament passages, as well as the New Testament vision of the glorious new heavens and new earth and new creation, is symbolized by the 1,000-year reign. And which means it's not, I guess, not really coming to an end in that perspective. But there's also another view of new creation premillennialism where there is maximal continuity between the millennium itself and the new creation, so that the millennium is the beginning of the new creation. And during that period, the whole creation is renewed, giving way to the new creation. And there's really if you think of a dimmer switch, the millennium begins and they're turning up the dimmer switch until it gets to maximal brightness. And so the distinction between millennium and new creation is minimized in the new creation premillennialism. In possibly, and this is debated, but possibly a representative of this view might be found in the Epistle of Barnabas, where it describes the seventh day of 1,000 years as the beginning of the eighth day. It is sort of the source and origin of the eighth day. But it's not 100% clear. The Epistle of Barnabas and its eschatology sections does not clarify exactly what all of that means and what that entails. But today, so if you have a perspective where millennium and new creation are either conflated or one just rolls into the other, that's what I mean by new creation premillennialism. The second millennial view, kind of to the right of that, is going to be what I call spiritual premillennialism. I'm calling it this because even though it's earthly, the emphasis is very much on the spiritual blessings that are going to occur during that millennial period. All humans, one key aspect of both new creation premillennialism as well as spiritual premillennialism, is that all humans living in that millennial period on this earth are resurrected/glorified. There are not going to be children born. No one is going to die. Everything will be perfect, and there will be no sin, suffering, death, devil, none of those things. And the key is all the occupants of the millennium are going to be resurrected in their spiritual bodies. That means glorified, immortal, incorruptible bodies. So no mortals living on the earth during that millennial period. This is, I guess, a best representative of this is Tertullian, or sometimes I even call this Tertullianic premillennialism. Around the year 200, Tertullian of Carthage, he had a view of the millennium in which when Christ returns, he's going to resurrect all of the dead, the righteous dead, and they are going to then occupy this millennial kingdom in their resurrected and glorified bodies. He also had this kind of strange view, and I've never encountered it anywhere else today or historically, but if you can imagine it, it probably exists somewhere out there. But he had this view that the increasing population of the earth in that millennial period was going to be accomplished by multiple phases of resurrection throughout the millennium, depending on our spiritual progress that we make in this life. So if we're 30, 60, or 100-folder, if we are maximal spiritual progress, we are going to be resurrected early on in the millennium and begin growing from glory to glory throughout that millennial period in our resurrected, glorified bodies. If we are a 60-folder, we might be raised maybe halfway through the millennium, and we'll be a little bit behind the first comers. And then if we're a 30-folder or whatever, we'll be raised later. And the idea is that some people will have an advantage over others, and that's the way he kind of understands eschatological reward. Not my view, but it is a view. And so the spiritual premillennialism is more the character of the millennium itself, downplay the physical, definitely the mortal, and upplay the spiritual and the immortal aspects of the millennium itself. So you can see how spiritual premillennialism and new creation premillennialism have some things in common. They're kind of, we're just moving slightly along that continuum. Then we get to what I'm going to call incarnational premillennialism, or what I sometimes call Irenaean premillennialism, although he's not the only one who held this, and he also kind of shared some views with others. So in incarnational premillennialism, the major difference is going to be from Tertullianic premillennialism is that Irenaeus had a view of the millennium in which the occupants, those who were living throughout that 1,000-year period, were going to be some resurrected glorified saints reigning with Christ in their resurrected glorified bodies, and at the same time, mortal survivors of the tribulation, Jews and Gentiles, entering into the kingdom and then having children. Their children are having children. So you're going to have these two types of humanity occupying the same time and space on this earth at the same during that millennial period. So to be clear, in spiritual as well as new creation premillennialism, generally speaking, it is only resurrected glorified saints occupying the millennium. In incarnational premillennialism, you have glorified saints and mortal saints occupying the millennium. That is the Irenaean premillennialism. It is also a very common view among what's sometimes called today dispensational premillennialism, but we're not going to talk about modern iterations of these per se. So also in Irenaean premillennialism, you do have the potential for death because you do have mortals, but day one, all of those people are saved, but their children might have their children or their children's children may harbor rebellion or whatever, and it's possible that they could fall under the curse of death for cause. I mean, I don't know. There are different views on this. In Irenaean or incarnational premillennialism, however, death is reduced to a rarity and a minimum and the exception to the rule. The rule is life because in Irenaeus's view, no righteous will ever die. So if you are genuinely regenerate and righteous, you will simply go from mortal to immortal through the process of that 1,000-year period, growing, as it were, from glory to glory. Irenaeus has this interesting statement where he says, the righteous man upon the earth will then forget to die. He kind of gets, along centuries and centuries and centuries, growing, sinning less, I guess. I suppose he would forget to sin and then forget to die. We might say that in Irenaean premillennialism, the mortals who occupy the millennium, their sanctification sort of transitions into glorification. Once again, not passing a judgment on the view. You can sort that all out yourself, but you do have to appreciate that there are varying perspectives on the millennium historically. Then we get to, so we have new creation premillennialism, spiritual premillennialism of Tertullian. Then you have Irenaean or incarnational premillennialism. Then the next iteration is what I'm just going to call Jewish Christian premillennialism. Has a lot of things in common with the Irenaean incarnational premillennialism, but it emphasizes a little bit more the geography and centrality of Jerusalem and Israel as the center of that kingdom. Now, to be fair, Irenaeus also emphasized that Jerusalem was going to be rebuilt and the Messiah was going to be reigning from Jerusalem, and even mentioned likely a restoration, repentance of Israel, etc. But it was significantly, I'm not going to say downplayed, but not emphasized. It wasn't the central feature of Irenaeus's eschatology. It's kind of a side feature. He much more emphasized the cosmic renewal and the universal transformation of all humans and all things, even though he also understood there'd be some role of restoration of Israel and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and those Old Testament prophecies were important. In Jewish Christian premillennialism, which you see in some of the more Jewish Christian writings, possibly in Papias of Hierapolis, we don't have all his writings. We also know of this by word of mouth, other people reporting what other people held. And we also see it in the eschatological editions, the Jewish Christian editions from the 2nd century-ish to this document called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. So there's a Jewish version of that, and then a Jewish Christian version where things were added, where there's much, and you possibly also see it in Justin Martyr, where he emphasizes, goes out of his way to emphasize that Jerusalem will be built and adorned in keeping with Ezekiel and the Old Testament prophets. So there's this stronger emphasis on the centrality of not just Israel, but Jerusalem and the Jewish people converted to Christ and representing that restoration of the nation of Israel in the future. In some forms of Jewish Christian premillennialism, there is also an emphasis on perhaps renewing or fulfilling some of the feast days, some of the celebrations as part of that Jewish nation of Israel restored, sometimes not. And then as you move further to the right, you do have some instances where they believe there will be a temple, and in also some cases that there will be actual animal sacrifices, which transitions us into then kind of straddles the last view of classic historical variations of premillennialism, which I'm going to call carnal premillennialism, or sometimes called carnal kilasm. Kilasm, Chilasm. Kilasm is just another, it's the Greek form of millennialism or premillennialism. And so in carnal kilasm, usually associated with heretics, false teachers, the millennium is going to be occupied by resurrected saints who themselves are going to be engaging in party time. Carnal pleasures, reward for their faithfulness in this life. It's going to be party time in the next life. It's going to be, they're going to be actually having feasts and gluttonous parties, and sometimes even revelries, and they're going to be having, they themselves are going to be having children, etc., etc. And the emphasis is on the earthiness and the indulgence and the physical reward, and think of kind of eschatological hedonism. There is a straddling between Jewish, Christian, and carnal kilasm, which strongly emphasizes the restoration of the temple and animal sacrifices, and kind of almost a going backwards in redemptive history on very much the earthy and animal, and death is common in carnal kilasm, or to be expected. So I would say, of the various perspectives within historical iterations of premillennialism, the one bad nation, the bad representative of that tradition, is going to be your kind of extreme carnal kilasm, which overemphasizes the physical and the earthly and de-emphasizes the heavenly and the spiritual. I think the least objectionable form of premillennialism is the Incarnational Premillennialism, held by Irenaeus of Lyon and that group. Although even in that, he has elements of Jewish premillennialism and elements of the spiritual premillennialism. And he also did believe that the millennium is the first stage of the future new creation. The new creation is accomplished by developments that are occurring during that millennial period. So this is why I think the best of all worlds is going to be your Incarnational Premillennialism of the Irenaean variety. So today, sometimes people imprecisely or sloppily or even naively talk about historic premillennialism. And this term, I think, really needs to go. It's better to think in terms of historic premillennialisms, because every one of these 5 forms of premillennialism can be found in the first couple centuries of the church. Carnal kilasm among heretics, Cerinthus, and some of those definitely marginal so-called Christians. But you also have Jewish Christian premillennialism, Nepos in Egypt. That seems to have been his view that was criticized by non-premillennialists, and Irenaean premillennialism, Tertullianic premillennialism, and possibly the premillennialism of the Epistle of Barnabas, though It's somewhat debatable. He doesn't dwell on it, but what I'm calling New Creation Premillennialism. So for someone today to claim that they hold to historic premillennialism and then define that by distancing themselves from things like, um, you know, mortal survivors of the tribulation and resurrected glorified saints occupying the same space as a dispensational premillennialism, or saying that a Israel or Jerusalem centered premillennialism is dispensational premillennialism or some other form of premillennialism, and to assert that their form of premillennialism, which is actually, more spiritual premillennialism or new creation premillennialism, it's a little bit, it's not a little, it's very misleading and a little bit heavy-handed. The reality is, and I'm going to end on this note, the concept of historic premillennialism vis-a-vis, in contrast with dispensational premillennialism or something like that, is particularly with regard to the nature of the millennium itself. I'm not talking about end times events or the 70th week of Daniel or the rapture, some of these other things that are kind of eschatological issues that are adjacent to the millennium. When we're talking about the millennium itself, that's what we're talking about, the nature and character of that. To describe historic premillennialism vis-a-vis dispensational premillennialism, and then contrast that with things that were present in various forms of premillennialism in the early church, is just not honest. Or it's probably honest, but it's ignorant, and it's just not aware of the variety of perspectives in the past. Historic premillennialism, as opposed to dispensational premillennialism, is a construct of the 20th century. It's not actually a representative of the way all of the premillennialists believed in the early church, first to third centuries. Because, as we said, there are about 5 different views along the spectrum: New Creation Premillennialism, Spiritual Premillennialism, Incarnational or Irenaean Premillennialism, Jewish Christian Premillennialism, and then the objectionable Carnal Kilasm. I hope this has helped a little bit to kind of clarify some things. In the next video or another video, I'm going to be dealing with varieties, historically speaking, of amillennialism. Thanks a lot. Hopefully this has been helpful.